Thank you, Presiding Officer, and I'm very glad that Graham Pearson has had the opportunity to contribute to the debate. When I was a member of the Justice 1 committee that Pauline McNeill led, I first met Graham Pearson over dinner in Glasgow to discuss drug problems. The dinner was excellent, but the message was compellingly disturbing. Graham, I recall on that occasion, told us of a drug dealer in Glasgow who'd gone in with a handful of cash and bought a brand new Bentley out of a showroom. He told us that that same individual had bought a fleet of cars for his private hire taxi company. He told us that this is a social problem that we're discussing today, but also an economic problem, perhaps 1.5 to 5% of our GDP. If you were just to look at it in economic terms, that's a loss of tax take of between £500 million and £1.5 billion for Scotland alone. But the reality is that the finance is relatively not the issue. I first spoke in the Parliament here on the 27th of October 2004 in a drugs debate, and at that point I said addiction is a feature of human behaviour and realistically it cannot be eliminated. James VI, of course, in his counterblast to the evils of tobacco 400 years ago, described smokers being by custom is peace and peace allured. The whole issue of addiction is very far from being a new one. It's worth perhaps saying that in the 1890s, Sears and Roebuck, a well-known American retailer, actually had in the catalogue they distribute to millions of homes across the United States, you could buy a syringe and cocaine for $1.50. So attitudes have changed and the impact of addiction has changed. But 100 years ago, it was recognised that this was a major issue. The first international drug control treaty was the International Opium Convention of 1912. That was from a conference that was held in Shanghai. From the 1950s, of course, for us, we started to see that the relatively small group of morphine addicts who were looked after by the GPs, and my father as a GP had a tiny handful that he looked after. But even then, we could see the impact of criminality. There was in 1951 a single drug addict who broke into a dispensary in the outskirts of London. Some years later, a decade later, it was discovered from that single criminal act 60 addicts had been created who are now suffering the problems. So it is all too easy for little acts to have huge consequences in this area. In the 1960s, of course, it was thought there were relatively few addicts. In fact, the Home Office in 1964 reported for the UK as a whole there were 753 addicts. I think at the time that was questioned and it was also questionable. But it certainly led with greater understanding to the Dangerous Drugs Act, although at that time it was thought the problem was so limited in Scotland there was actually no provision whatsoever for Scotland. But by the late 70s, boy, did we know that we had a problem. Today we've got this excellent report before us. That is showing what we're doing to deal with that problem. And we certainly can't, just by simply reversing the actions that got us to this position, get to a position where we undo it. We've got to be proactive. Originally, we sought simply to support the addicts and their addiction was be dealt with medically. But now, of course, addiction has this huge reach into criminality. It also is a public health and infection issue that has to be dealt with. Let's not forget, too, that this addiction, the opioid addiction that's the subject of today's debate, is, of course, part of a whole series of addictions we have in our society: alcohol, gambling, nicotine. I even had a member of staff who worked for me, among the hundreds who did, who was addicted to a proprietary nasal spray. He consumed 20 bottles a day, although it didn't seem to affect his life. And the illegal drugs that we are talking about today and the issues with which we have to deal in that context are in part related to the free cigarettes that were dispensed to servicemen during the Second World War, desensitising us to the idea of addiction being something that should be avoided. It's worth, perhaps in closing, Presiding Officer, welcoming very much the consensual nature of this debate, bringing different points of view and different experience and different inputs, yes, but all pointing in the same direction, and I think Willie Rennie made reference to that. Two examples of how you can mishandle it are perhaps worth going back to. Derek Hatton, who was the Deputy Labour leader of Liverpool City Council, wanted to attack Margaret Thatcher. Now, I might be up for that, but he did so by designating Liverpool as Smack City. We're still living on the back of that. And in my constituency, the actions of our now-deceased GP, Sandy Wisely, who talked up a drug problem in Fraserburgh, quite unnecessarily and unjustifiably, are something we still deal with today in reputational terms. We've had a good balanced debate. Let's hope that continues. And I very much support the essence of what's said in the Labour amendment, but very much the government's motion. Presiding Officer.